Hi, this is Miss Rocco. I'll be reading the Meaning of Freedom text. You'll read this text and complete the chart as you go along when you find the numbered parts of the text that tell you where to go to fill in the chart. The story of the Black freedom struggle begins with slavery. The North American colonial economy depended on the forced labor of enslaved Africans and African Americans. Their descendants remained enslaved well into the 19th century. In this section, you will read about the legacies of slavery that limited freedom for African Americans after emancipation. You will see how state and local governments and white citizens in the South worked to ensure that Blacks remained at the bottom of Southern society, and examine how African Americans responded to this oppression. In 1861, the year the Civil War began, most enslaved Black people in the South labored on plantations, large white-owned farms. Many picked cotton in grueling conditions for white planters to sell in the international cotton market. Although slavery in the North had ended much earlier, the Northern economy was closely tied to the plantations of the South. In addition, African Americans in the North continued to face racism and discrimination. The Union victory in the Civil War brought freedom to more than 4 million African Americans in the South, but the future of Black people in the United States remained unclear. The passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, officially banning slavery throughout the country, sparked questions about the meaning of emancipation. What would freedom look like? What opportunities, resources, and rights was the government responsible for providing? How would African Americans be made equal citizens of a country that had been built on their enslavement? You can now fill in the first line of your Steps Towards Equality chart. We just read about the 13th Amendment. In the portion that says, what was it? You would be able to write a definition in your own words, such as a law meaning an amendment to the Constitution that ended slavery. For each of these different topics, you'll be thinking about how they helped or hindered African American equality. The 13th Amendment helped achieve equality because slavery was no longer legal in the United States. What was freedom like for African Americans in the South? For African Americans in the South, freedom meant little without the resources and protection needed to achieve economic independence and develop prosperous communities. Since it had been illegal in most states for an enslaved person to learn how to read and write, the vast majority of freed slaves were illiterate. Most had little more than the clothes on their backs. Black freedmen and freed women pressed the federal government to provide them with equal rights and land on which to start their new lives. At the end of the Civil War, Union General William Sherman set aside land on the South Carolina and Georgia coast for Black families to settle on 40-acre plots. This inspired hope in many freed people that they would receive land in the years to come, but the federal government returned the property to its former white owners and was unwilling to distribute land to African Americans. Without property or money to start their own farms, most Blacks in the South became sharecroppers. Sharecroppers worked plots on land white plantations in exchange for a share, usually 1/2, when the cotton they grew on the land was sold. Most sharecroppers remained stuck in economic dependency and poverty. White Southerners rejected the idea that freedom meant equal rights, land, and economic opportunity for Black people. They did everything in their power to ensure that Blacks remained second-class citizens. Following the war, white mobs attacked African Americans, beating and killing Black professionals and soldiers who had fought for the Union Army. Despite these hardships, newly freed men and women worked to rebuild families that had been torn apart by slavery and to develop vibrant Black communities. What was Reconstruction? In 1865, just 3 days after the end of the Civil War, John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Abraham Lincoln. The job of unifying and rebuilding the country fell in the hands of Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson. Johnson wanted to return the country to normal quickly. He allowed Southern states to elect all-white governments, and many Confederate leaders returned to power. These governments immediately passed laws called the Black Codes to control the newly freed Black population. By criminalizing unemployment and putting limitations on Black freedom, these laws kept African Americans poor and dependent on whites for employment. A group of Northern politicians known as the Radical Republicans had a different vision than President Johnson. They believed that in order for African Americans in the South to be truly free, the federal government needed to protect them from racist policies and violence, and to ensure their right to vote. The radical Republicans pushed the federal government to reconstruct the South before admitting former Confederate states back into the Union. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 allowed the federal government to govern the South until Southern governments did more to protect the rights of African Americans. The federal government deployed troops and appointed military leaders to oversee the region. During the Reconstruction period, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, granting equal protection under the law to all citizens regardless of race, and the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote. These Reconstruction amendments empowered the federal government to demand that states respect the rights and freedoms of African American citizens. Southern states would be readmitted to the Union only after they had ratified the 14th Amendment. Reconstruction opened up many political and economic opportunities for African Americans. Black voters went to the polls in large numbers and elected black officials to government posts. In some places, 90% of registered black voters cast their ballots. During the Reconstruction period, over 1,500 African Americans held political office, and 16 African Americans were elected to the U.S. Congress. Black politicians, working with a small number of white Republican allies, enacted legislation that helped African Americans throughout the South. Biracial state governments created public school systems that served both black and white students. The black codes were abolished. Hundreds of black men served on Southern juries, bringing a degree of fairness to the court system. Reconstruction gave African Americans hope that freedom and opportunity were possible. How did white Southerners react to Reconstruction? Most white Southerners resisted Reconstruction and opposed the new amendments to the Constitution. They sought to restore the white supremacy that existed during slavery. The total control of Southern society by whites was often referred to as white supremacy. Although white Southerners varied in their attitudes towards blacks, most resented their rising status of African Americans and the federal government's attempts to interfere with Southern politics and society. During slavery, white slaveholders had thought of African Americans as property, not full human beings. When slavery ended, they were unwilling to consider freed blacks their equals. White landowners depended on cheap black labor for their economic success. They wanted African Americans to remain poor, working on plantations as sharecroppers. Many poor whites, who had always had a higher status than African Americans under slavery, did not want black people to rise above them on the social ladder. To restore white supremacy, the white Southerners used violence to drive blacks from politics and take control of all political and economic power in the South. Several white terrorist organizations developed in the period, the most famous of which was the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK and other groups used violence and fear to force black elected officials and voters out of politics entirely. While not all white Southerners engaged or approved of violence against black people, most believed that white supremacy was the natural order of life in the South. The few whites in the South who supported the Republican Party's Reconstruction policies, were ridiculed or worse. At various times during Reconstruction, the federal government took action to suppress white violence and protect the rights of African Americans. The federal government's interest in intervening on behalf of African Americans began to dwindle in the 1870s. How did Reconstruction come to an end? As the 1870s wore on, federal Reconstruction began to lose steam. An economic crisis struck the country, and the Republican Party grew more concerned with the state of the economy and less interested in the plight of former slaves. Northern politicians began to sympathize with white Southerners who blamed economic problems and political corruption in the South on the new black leadership. It is the dregs of the population, dressed in the robes of their intelligent predecessors, asserting over them the rule of ignorance and corruption. It is barbarism overwhelming civilization by physical force. James S. Pike, New York Tribune, 1873. Democrats regained control of several Southern state governments due to the fraud, violence, and intimidation used by whites against black voters. These white groups called themselves Redeemers because they believed they were redeeming their state governments from the control by black Republicans. The controversial presidential election of 1876 marked the retreat of the federal government from the South. In an informal deal known as the Compromise of 1877, Southern Democrats agreed not to dispute Republican Rutherford B. Hayes's election if he promised to stop federal interference in Southern affairs and end Reconstruction. Shortly after coming to power, Hayes removed federal officials from the South. With those officials gone, many of the policies that had helped African Americans during Reconstruction were rolled back. Many African Americans felt betrayed by the Republican Party. The whole South had got into the hands of the very men who made us slaves. A Free African American, 1876. How did the Mississippi Constitution of 1890 disenfranchise African Americans? Violence against black voters was particularly fierce in Mississippi, where black voter participation dropped off more steeply than in any other state in the South. It is no secret that there has not been a full vote and a fair count in Mississippi since 1875. In plain words, we have been stuffing ballot boxes, committing perjury, and carrying the elections by fraud and violence until the whole machinery for elections was about to rot. A white judge from Mississippi in 1890. The 15th Amendment prohibited the denial of voting rights based on race, but in 1890, Mississippi adopted a new constitution designed to prevent African Americans from voting. The state introduced literacy tests that most black people could not pass and poll taxes that most people could not afford. These requirements for voter registration were usually only imposed on African Americans. By 1892, black Mississippians had been all but eliminated from politics. When the United States Supreme Court upheld the Mississippi Constitution in Williams v. Mississippi, 1898, other states were free to pursue policies that disenfranchised blacks. Jim Crow, Mississippi. The Jim Crow era in the South, the period between 1890 and World War II, was marked by extreme segregation, inequality, and racial violence. Although the 13th Amendment had freed black people from bondage, African Americans remained at the very bottom of Southern society, denied political rights and economic opportunity. What were Jim Crow laws? In Mississippi and across the South, local governments passed laws segregating nearly every aspect of public life, including restrooms, public school classrooms, and streetcars. Black and white prisoners could not share jail cells. Hospital patients of different races were kept apart, and nurses were forbidden from treating people of other races. In the 1896 Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson, the federal government ruled that segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment's requirement of equal protection under the law. Black and white people could be legally separated as long as they were provided with equal services and opportunities. This policy became known as separate but equal, but equality was never the reality in Mississippi or anywhere in the United States. African Americans consistently received vastly inferior services. Mississippi had a strictly followed tradition of racial inequality and oppression. African Americans and whites typically lived in separate neighborhoods. Local customs ensured that interactions between the two typically reinforced African Americans' inferior social status. For example, whites used demeaning phrases like boy or auntie to refer to black adults, and African Americans had to look down or get off the sidewalk when they passed white people on the street. This code of racial etiquette was a constant part of life in Mississippi, and when African Americans failed to heed, they put their lives at risk. How is violence used to reinforce white supremacy? Whites in Mississippi maintained white supremacy by attacking individuals who failed to submit to whites. African Americans were beaten or killed, or simply for standing up for themselves. Violent white groups also attacked people to symbolize black achievement and political activism. Black landowners, doctors, political leaders, and voters were particularly vulnerable. Following World War I, white groups attacked black veterans returning to Mississippi. The official legal system never gave black Mississippians a fair trial, and white mobs often took justice into their own hands. When black Mississippians violated the racial hierarchy of Jim Crow society, white supremacists responded with violence, including public lynchings, which were executions. White people from all classes gathered to watch mobs torture and hang black people. Often, whites justified lynchings by claiming that the victim had raped a white woman, but these accusations were almost always false. Although some white leaders spoke out against violence, the majority of white society felt that lynchings were necessary to maintain the social order and control African Americans.